My name is Claire Morgan, and I was 38 years old the morning I received a package from a woman who had been dead for 8 months. The package arrived on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:14 a.m. I remember the time because I was sitting in the office of my bakery looking over an overdue invoice when a delivery driver knocked on the back door. At first, I assumed it was a shipment of flour. Deliveries arrived at our bakery almost every day, but the moment I saw the name written on the package, I knew this was different. The sender's name was Emily Harper. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. Emily Harper was my older sister, and she had been dead for nearly 8 months. Yet somehow, I signed for the package, the driver left, and suddenly I was standing in my kitchen holding a box that should not have existed. Around me, the bakery continued as normal. The ovens kept running. Employees carried trays of bread back and forth. Customers came and went. But for me, time seemed to stop. My eyes kept returning to the same name, Emily, my sister, the same sister whose funeral I had attended, the same sister whose grave I visited every month with fresh flowers, the same sister who could not possibly send me a package 8 months after her death. I carried the box into my office and closed the door. Then I opened it carefully. Inside was only a large brown envelope. No gift, no explanation, no letter. Just an envelope with my name written on it in Emily's handwriting. My hands began to shake. Because people die, but their handwriting doesn't. Seeing it felt like someone had suddenly brought her voice back into the room. I carefully opened the envelope. Several photographs slid out and spread across my desk. At first, I couldn't even understand what I was looking at. Then my stomach dropped. Every photograph showed the same boy, my nephew, Ethan, Emily's 13-year-old son. In some of the pictures, he was carrying heavy grocery bags through a parking lot. In others, he was mowing lawns. One photograph showed him unloading large boxes from a truck. Then I noticed the dates and timestamps printed on the photos, and a chill ran through my body. Every single photograph had been taken on school days, weekdays, in the middle of the afternoon when he should have been in school. I sat up straight. None of it made sense. After Emily died, Ethan had gone to live with so short it only took a few seconds to read, but the impact would stay with me forever. Claire, if you're reading this, it means my package finally reached you. I prepared it a long time ago before things became completely impossible. If I'm no longer here, please look after Ethan. Don't ask David questions, don't warn anyone. Just go see for yourself. With love, Emily. I read it once, then again, then a third time. Each time, part of me expected the words to somehow change, but they didn't. Just go see for yourself. That sentence kept repeating in my mind. Don't call. Don't ask questions. Don't tell anyone. Just look. Emily always chose her words carefully. If she had written that, she had a reason. And suddenly I remembered a conversation from 6 months before she died. At the time, she was undergoing chemotherapy. The two of us were sitting alone in a hospital room. The nurse had stepped out. David wasn't there. It was just the two of us. That day, Emily seemed unusually exhausted, not from the illness, from something heavier, like she was carrying a burden she couldn't share with anyone. Out of nowhere, she had asked me, "If you ever felt something was wrong, would you trust your instincts?" I had laughed, then jokingly replied, "Probably not." She smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that suggested she already knew I would give that answer. At the time, I didn't understand what she meant, but now, sitting at my desk surrounded by those photographs and that note, I wondered for the first time if she had been talking about Ethan. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I tried to work, but my attention was somewhere else. By evening, I had made a decision. I would not call David. I would not mention the photographs. I would not tell anyone about the note, because Emily had specifically asked me not to. I would do exactly what she told me to do. I would go see for myself. 3 days later, I arrived in the small town of Maple Ridge where David and Ethan lived. I didn't announce my visit. I didn't call ahead. I simply drove straight to their house. David answered the door. For a brief moment, surprise flashed across his face. Then he immediately smiled. "Claire." He pulled me into a hug. Everything seemed normal, maybe a little too normal. I smiled back. Thought I'd come visit. You're always welcome. The response came instantly, so quickly that it felt rehearsed. I stepped inside. The house was spotless. Family photographs covered the walls. Fresh flowers sat on the dining room table. Everything looked exactly the way people imagine a happy family home should look. Then I realized someone was missing. "Where's Ethan?" I asked. David's smile tightened for a fraction of a second. "He's helping a friend." The answer echoed in my mind. Helping a friend. I remembered the photographs. Heavy bags, mowing lawns, hauling boxes, helping a friend. "When will he be back?" I asked. David glanced at the clock. "Not sure." Then there was that smile again, and that same uneasy feeling. I stayed for nearly an hour. We talked about the weather, work, Emily, everything, except Ethan. And every time I mentioned Ethan's name, the conversation somehow drifted somewhere else. So subtly that most people probably wouldn't have noticed. But I did. Eventually I left. But I didn't go home. Instead, I parked across the street and waited inside my car, because by then I was certain of one thing. Emily hadn't sent that package because she was confused. She had sent it because she wanted me to see something. And as the sun slowly disappeared behind the houses of Maple Ridge, I sat there watching David Harper's home. 43 minutes later, an old pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A thin teenage boy climbed out. His arms were loaded with a stack of construction materials so large that he looked like he was struggling to carry them. The boy was Ethan, and the exhaustion on his face did not belong to a 13-year-old child. I sat in my car across the street, watching David Harper's house. The boy who stepped out of that old pickup truck 43 minutes later was definitely Ethan. His arms were full of long pieces of wood and metal. He was struggling to keep them balanced, and it was obvious the weight was far too much for him. A 13-year-old kid carries a school backpack, not construction materials. I watched him carefully. He moved slowly toward the house. His shoulders were slumped. His steps looked heavy, and the strangest thing was that there was no sign of a child's energy on his face. He looked like someone who had spent the entire day working. David came outside immediately. He glanced around, took the materials from Ethan's arms, and carried them inside. Ethan followed behind him. The whole thing probably lasted less than a minute, but it stayed burned into my memory. A little while later, the lights remained on, the curtains were closed, and I finally started my engine and drove home. But I barely slept that night. The next morning, I did something I probably should have done much sooner. I called Ethan's school. I couldn't ask direct questions, but I was his aunt, and my name was still listed as an emergency contact in the school records. After a brief conversation, I was able to get some general information. Just before the call ended, one comment caught my attention. "Ethan has missed quite a few days this year." I immediately asked, "How many is quite a few?" The woman gave me the number. My grip tightened around the phone. These weren't just a few absences. The number was unusually high. When I hung up, the photograph of Emily sitting on my desk seemed to stare back at me. Now the pictures were starting to make sense. If Ethan wasn't in school, then he was doing the jobs shown in those photographs. That evening, I decided to return to Maple Ridge. This time, I didn't go straight to the house. Instead, I spent some time around the town's main area. Maple Ridge was a small town. In towns like that, people know each other, and if you're patient enough, the truth often reveals itself. About an hour later, I was standing outside a hardware store when I suddenly spotted a familiar face. Ethan. He was walking out of the back section of the store. A small envelope was in his hand. A few seconds later, the store owner came outside and patted him on the shoulder. They exchanged a few words. Then the owner smiled and wished him goodbye. Ethan headed toward the street. I stayed exactly where I was. I didn't need any more guesses. He was working, and not just occasionally, regularly. Keeping my distance, I followed him. He walked straight to a bus stop, sat down, and pulled out the same envelope. He opened it. Cash. There was cash inside. He counted it quickly and slipped it back into his pocket. A sick feeling settled in my stomach. A 13-year-old working a few hours after school was one thing, but the photographs, the absences, and now cash payments, together they pointed toward a very different story. At that moment, Ethan looked up. His eyes landed on me. For several seconds, we simply stared at each other. Then surprise spread across his face. "Aunt Claire?" I forced a smile and walked over. "Hey, buddy." He stood up. He had gotten taller since the last time I saw him, but the exhaustion on his face was even more noticeable. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I could ask you the same question." A faint smile appeared on his face. Then it disappeared. I glanced at the envelope in his hand. He immediately shoved it into his pocket. That small movement said a lot. I didn't bring it up. Instead, we went to a nearby cafe and sat down. I ordered food for him. The moment it arrived, I noticed the same thing I had once noticed in Olivia. Ethan didn't immediately start eating. Instead, he asked how much it cost. "How expensive is all this?" I stared at him for a few seconds. "Why are you worried about that?" He lowered his eyes. "Just wondering." Softly, I said, "You're a kid, Ethan. You shouldn't have to worry about prices." He didn't answer. A few minutes later, I asked him about school. He instantly became uncomfortable. Then he said, "I catch up later." "Catch up on what?" "The stuff I miss." "How much are you missing?" He fell silent. So silent that I knew I had touched the right nerve. Then he looked out the window and quietly said, "Dad says we all have to work hard right now." Something inside me broke, because suddenly I realized this wasn't just about having a job. Ethan had been convinced that the family's responsibilities belonged on his shoulders too, the shoulders of a 13-year-old child. And for the first time, a frightening question entered my mind. If Ethan was earning money, where was that money actually going? And I was going to get the answer much sooner than I expected. That night, after I got home, I stayed awake for hours. The photographs Emily had sent were spread across my desk. Beside them sat Ethan's school attendance report. Then my mind drifted back to Ethan sitting across from me in the cafe. He was 13 years old, but he talked like someone carrying the financial weight of an entire family on his shoulders. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Emily had not sent that package by accident. She had known. Somehow she had known that something would go wrong after she was gone. The next morning, I was at work when a message appeared on my phone. It was from Ethan. I opened it immediately. There was only one line. "Are you not going to tell anyone that we talked?" I stared at the screen. A few seconds later, I typed a reply. "If you're not in danger, then no." About a minute later, another message arrived. "Okay." That was all, just one word, but that small exchange left me uneasy, because normal kids don't send messages like that. Normal kids aren't afraid that someone might find out they spoke to their aunt. That evening, I decided to drive back to Maple Ridge. This time, I headed straight to the storage complex on the far side of town. I couldn't explain exactly why. It was just a feeling. Years of investigative work had taught me one thing. When enough small facts start pointing in the same direction, you shouldn't ignore them. I parked my car and looked around. A few minutes later, I spotted a familiar truck, David's truck. It was parked in front of a row of storage units. I kept my distance. About 10 minutes later, David unlocked one of the units and went inside. Then I saw something that completely caught me off guard. Ethan was already in there. He was lifting large boxes, one after another, over and over again. It looked like he had been working there for hours. I stood there watching. Then my eyes drifted toward the contents of the storage unit. Old furniture, tools, machinery, several expensive electronic items, and boxes. Dozens of boxes, a lot of boxes. David stepped outside and started talking to Ethan. I was too far away to hear the words, but I could clearly see Ethan's face. He wasn't happy. He was simply following instructions. A few minutes later, David drove away. Ethan was left alone. Seeing my opportunity, I started walking toward him. When he saw me, he jumped. "Aunt Claire." He almost whispered it. "What are you doing here?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Just helping." The same answer, the same words, "just helping." I lowered my voice. "How often?" He looked away. "Often." "How often?" A few seconds passed. Then he quietly answered, "Almost every day." My heart sank. Every day. After school, on weekends, during breaks, almost every day. I looked around at all the boxes stacked nearby. "What's all this?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know." But his expression suggested otherwise, or maybe he simply wasn't telling the whole truth. Then my eyes landed on something in the corner, an old metal filing cabinet. One of the drawers was slightly open, and through the gap, I could see a name: Emily Harper. I froze. Emily's name, here, inside this storage unit. Before I could say anything, David's truck appeared again. The change in Ethan was immediate. Tension flooded his face. He lowered his voice. "You should go." "Why?" He didn't answer. He simply repeated himself. "Please." The fear in his eyes was real. There was nothing fake about it. I turned around and headed back toward my car, but now I had a new question, a much bigger question. If Emily's files were being stored in that unit, why wasn't David keeping them at home? And what exactly was he trying to hide from Ethan? That night, I couldn't sleep again, but this time, the reason was different. For the first time, I felt certain this story wasn't only about a child being forced to work. Somewhere in the middle of all this, money was involved, a lot of money, and I was starting to fear that whatever Emily had discovered before she died was much bigger than I had ever imagined. The next morning, the first thing that came to mind was that storage unit, Emily's files, Ethan's fear, David's behavior, and that strange feeling that had been following me for the past several weeks. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the real story still hadn't come to light. I hadn't even finished breakfast when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I answered. A woman was on the other end. She introduced herself. She was one of Emily's old friends. Her name was Jessica. I had met her once or twice years ago. After a few minutes of polite conversation, she suddenly asked, "Do you think something feels off too?" I was silent for a few seconds. Then I said, "Why would you ask that?" There was a brief pause. Then Jessica spoke quietly. "Emily talked to me a few months before she died." My heart immediately started beating faster. "What did she say?" "She was really worried." I sat up straight in my chair. Jessica continued. "She told me that if anything happened to her, I should keep an eye on Ethan." My hands went cold, almost the exact same thing she had written in her note. "Did she tell you why?" I asked. "No." Then after a moment, Jessica added, "But she said she was worried about money." I closed my eyes. There it was again, money. Every road kept leading back to the same place. After the call ended, I didn't go back to work. Instead, I spent the next several hours reviewing bank records, property records, and public documents. Hours passed. Then I found something that immediately caught my attention. Emily's life insurance records. I had already seen the payout amount before, but this time, I carefully reviewed the beneficiary information. That was when I saw a name. David Harper. That was expected. He had been her husband. But beneath that was something else. Ethan Harper Trust. I stared at the screen. A trust fund. A separate fund established specifically for Ethan. The kind of fund meant for a child's future. College, living expenses, financial security. I started digging deeper. A short while later, a number appeared on my screen that practically pushed me back in my chair. The amount was enormous, large enough to secure a child's entire future. And suddenly I remembered Ethan's words. "Dad says we all have to work hard right now." If there was that much money set aside for him, why was he missing school to work? That evening, I called Ethan. At first, he didn't answer. About an hour later, he called me back. His voice sounded quieter than usual. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah." But he was lying. I could hear it. "Ethan, what happened?" For several seconds, all I could hear was his breathing. Then he quietly said, "Dad's mad." "Why?" "Because he saw me talking to you." My grip tightened around the phone. "And then?" "Nothing." But his voice suggested otherwise. A lot more than nothing. I gently asked, "Did he yell at you?" Silence. Then a very quiet answer. "A little." I didn't believe him. Children often minimize the mistakes adults make. I changed the subject. We talked for a few more minutes. Then suddenly he said something that sent a chill down my spine. "Aunt Claire?" "Yeah?" If there's money in my name? My heart nearly stopped. Should I know about it? For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Why are you asking that? Silence filled the line, so much silence that I thought the call had dropped. Then he finally answered. I overheard something. What? Dad was talking to someone on the phone. Now I was completely alert. What did he say? Ethan took a deep breath. Then he said that if I don't find out anything until I'm 18, everything will be easier. A shock ran through my entire body. I stood up from my chair. Because for the first time, this no longer felt like suspicion. Something was definitely being hidden. And maybe that was the reason Emily had prepared that package before she died. After the call ended, I stood by the window for a long time. Outside, darkness had already fallen, but the darkness wasn't the part that frightened me. The frightening part was realizing that Ethan might not even know what existed in his own name. And if he didn't know, someone else certainly did, and that person seemed determined to keep the truth hidden for as long as possible. What I didn't know then was that within the next few days, a single document would land in my hands that would change everything. And after that, lying would become almost impossible for David Harper. Over the next several days, I spent almost every free minute searching for the document I had become convinced existed somewhere. By now, I had plenty of questions, but the answers were still incomplete. Emily's note, the storage unit, Ethan working, the trust fund in his name, and David's comment that Ethan had overheard. If he doesn't find out anything until he turns 18, everything will be easier. Through all of it, one fact stood out above everything else. Emily had chosen me for a reason. She knew I wasn't the kind of person who let things go. Then, on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. I was sitting in my office when a new email appeared in my inbox. The sender's name made me stare at the screen for several seconds. Jessica, Emily's old friend. Attached to the email was a scanned document. Below it was a single line. I think Emily wanted this to reach you. I opened the file immediately, and the more I read, the faster my heart began to beat. It was a legal declaration written by Emily, prepared only a few months before her death. There were many details inside, but one paragraph changed everything. Emily had clearly stated that the money in Ethan's trust fund was to be used solely for Ethan's future. College, healthcare, living expenses, long-term security, and most importantly, she had written that if the trust was ever used for personal gain, it should be reviewed immediately. I sat frozen in my chair, because now I had more than suspicion. I had direction. That same day, I contacted an attorney, then another, then another. Over the following weeks, the things David had spent years hiding slowly began to surface. There had been multiple withdrawals from the trust account. Some were legitimate, some were not. Money had gone to places that had absolutely nothing to do with Ethan. A new boat, expensive vacations, personal expenses, and several payments with no clear explanation at all. The deeper the investigation went, the clearer it became that this wasn't only about money. It was about trust. And that trust had been broken. When the official review began, David denied everything. He claimed it was all a misunderstanding. He insisted he had done everything for his son. He said people were trying to ruin his reputation, but the documents weren't on his side. The records weren't on his side. The facts weren't on his side. Eventually, the day of the formal hearing arrived. I can still remember that room. The attorneys, the officials, the financial records. And sitting in the middle of it all was Ethan, a 13-year-old boy who had spent the last year and a half believing that the family's responsibilities belonged on his shoulders. When he was asked questions, he didn't accuse anyone. He didn't get angry. He didn't create drama. He simply told the truth. The truth about missing school, the truth about working, and the truth that he constantly felt like a burden whenever money was spent on him. The room fell completely silent, because sometimes the simplest truths are the most powerful. A few months later, the decision was finalized. Oversight of the trust fund was changed, all financial records were reviewed, and new protections were put in place to safeguard Ethan's interests. But for me, the most important outcome wasn't a legal decision. The most important change happened inside Ethan. At first, he could hardly believe he no longer needed to work. Many times he would ask, "Should I get a job and help out?" And every time I gave him the same answer. Your job is to be a kid. At first, he didn't understand what I meant, but gradually he did. He started attending school regularly, his grades improved, he joined the baseball team, he made friends, and most importantly, he started talking about the future. For the first time, one evening we were sitting on the porch of my house. The sun was setting, the air was cool, and Ethan was talking about college. College, the very thing his mother had created the trust fund for, the very future she had tried to protect when she sent that package. Suddenly, Ethan grew quiet. Then he looked at me. Aunt Claire? Yeah? He thought for a few seconds, then he asked, Do you think Mom knew? My eyes filled with tears. Knew what? That you'd help me. For a moment, I didn't answer. Then I smiled and said, I think she was absolutely certain. Ethan lowered his head and smiled. At that moment, I realized something. Emily's package wasn't just a warning. It was trust, a mother's trust, and in the end, that trust had not been broken. A few months ago, I visited her grave again. Like always, I brought flowers, but this time felt different. This time, I finally had answers. I placed the flowers down, stood there quietly for a moment, then softly said, I found him, Emily. Found. A gentle breeze moved through the cemetery. The branches overhead swayed, and for the first time in 8 months, I felt like maybe everything was finally going to be okay. If you've listened to this story all the way to the end, thank you. Take care of yourself. Take care of your family, and remember, sometimes the most important messages are the ones that arrive after we think it's already too late. Goodbye.